Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I'm Vanessa Kortekaas from the Financial Times, and I'm thrilled to be joined by a fantastic panel today. The theme for our discussion is embracing change, adapting to the new normal. And this covers everything from how businesses have been adapting to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, the economic crisis, how they juggle issues like diversity and sustainability while navigating this very difficult economic climate. So there's lots to discuss. We have a great panel today, which consists of Jonas Prising, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Chairman and CEO of ManpowerGroup, Jean-Paul Agon, Chairman and CEO of L'Oreal, Mellody Hobson, President and co-CEO of Ariel Investments and Vice Chairman of Starbucks, Maceda, Global CEO of Bain and Company, and McKay, Chief Executive Officer of Invest in Canada. Ian, it's great to have another Canadian on the panel, but thank you to all of you for taking the time, and thank you to those of you watching as well. I'm going to do mostly high-level questions. I might cater them slightly different to each of you, but there's lots to cover here, and also feel free to jump in if you have a point you want to add as well. To start things off, though, I'm going to ask you all the exact same question, and I'm looking for just a very short answer for this one, which is, what is the single biggest change that your company or organization has had to make since the start of the pandemic? So the one caveat here is that you can't say video conferencing because we all do video conferencing now. That's the new normal, and we know that. So anything apart from that, single biggest change you've had to make to adapt, in no particular order. Manny, would you like to kick things off?
I'm glad you made that exception, Vanessa. I'd say the single biggest change for us is up and down the organization embracing the broader definition of value. Let's call it ESG, stakeholder capitalism, and everything we do. That's just become real this year more than ever.
Okay, good answer and nice and short. Thank you, Manny. Mellody, maybe I'll come to you next. Single biggest change that you've had to make.
I think really giving a lot of power and decision rights to very junior young people, because we are spread apart and we need people to make decisions.
Okay, another good one and an interesting point about giving more power to young people. We might come back to that later. Jean-Paul, single biggest change for you?
I don't know if it was a change, but it was a priority, and priority was to protect employees, of course. It was the first time in the history of the company that employees were threatened about their safety, and it was super important, but also to protect our ecosystem, to protect our customers, to protect our suppliers. So protection was really the priority and the obsession.
Okay. Also, we'll be coming back to that point too, I think, about leadership and sort of responsibility to employees through this crisis later in the session. Jonas, would you like to go next?
The biggest change, in addition to all of the things that my colleagues on the panel have already talked about, is really to do everything we can to enable human potential to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. And that remains the one source of amazement and delight in their very different circumstances on how quickly the organization was able to adapt to this once you give them the tools and the freedom to act under their own choice. And that's been the biggest learning.
Okay, and finally, Ian, we'll come to you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and first of all, thanks. It's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. As an investment and promotion agency, I think the biggest change we have noted is how we're viewing the evolution of supply chains. We were used to, as was everybody, to the normal matrix of supply chains being just-in-time delivery of the cheapest possible products. And we're now viewing it in the world of, are we going to shift to what is a more resilient supply chain framework? So from cheapest supply chains to resilient supply chains, and how Canada fits into that shift if in fact it takes place.
Very good point, and I think we'll come back to you for more details on that too. Thank you all for keeping those answers short. It's very hard. Usually you don't get short answers, so thank you. And now, as we go into the broader discussion, feel free to give more detailed answers. But I think the first sort of broad area I want to start with is the U.S. and global economic recovery, and covering this from different angles for each of you. So, Jonas, I'm going to come back to you first on this point. Can you talk about the current levels of unemployment that we're seeing in the US, the UK, how this recovery compares to the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and just when you think we might return to pre-pandemic levels of hiring?
So, Vanessa, from a labor market perspective, the decline that we saw in March and April and in May was much worse than anything we've seen in our close to 75-year history of working across 80 labor markets. And the depth of that decline, is greater than the Great Recession. And the speed was unprecedented, of course, a much used word. Since then, though, we've seen a very rapid recovery. So we go from a Great Recession level unemployment globally in most places, certainly in Europe and in the US, and then now moving our way back to what is, a reasonably sized recession environment and reflected in improving labor markets, but are still far away from where they were just at the beginning of the year. What we have seen is a improvement in the labor markets, but the rate of improvement is slowing down, and you can see this in the UK, you can see it in the US, and you can also see it in other parts of the world. And we would expect it to take a number of years to come back to the levels that we saw in 2019. Our best guess, if I knew exactly, of course, we'd be delighted, but that's going to be hard to predict. But I think as we think about the rate of the recovery, it's probably going to take 2 to 3 years at least until we get back closer to where we were in 19. So we predict a slow and gradual recovery over time. Of course, the visible unemployment is quite low in Europe because we have extensive furlough schemes in place, which is very different from how the US labor market has coped with this downturn. But knowing the underlying levels of activity, they are similar to a recessionary environment, but improving. But it will take a number of years to get back to where we were.
I just want to follow up to that. I mean, is it inevitable that certain jobs that are lost now will simply never come back? I mean, when you look at either some of the worst hit industries or structural changes in the labor market that COVID-19, this crisis, has accelerated, can you talk about some of those jobs that might be lost forever and the challenge of reskilling, retraining people? Whose responsibility is that? Is that the private sector, government, both?
The recovery of the labor markets, we believe, is going to be a two-speed recovery. Frankly, there are some industries that have done very well during the pandemic. If you think about tech, you think about logistics, you can have a number of industries that have done very well. And by the same token, there are industries that have really been hit hard. Of course, anything related to experience, hospitality and travel and the like, and those industries that support those activities. I think in that group of those industries that are still suffering from significant undercapacity and significant issues around their businesses, some of them, once the pandemic gets back and we move through this healthcare crisis, will come back and will come back strongly because it is something that we as consumers want to experience. Others, however, may be more permanently impaired. And that's where our biggest challenge will come. Because this two-speed recovery means people with skills will have plenty of access, and frankly, many of them are already fully engaged and keep on working with their industries today. But those industries that are negatively impacted, which happen to be some of the service sectors that also employ tens of millions of people, they are the ones that are going to see a much slower recovery, much as we saw under the comeback from the Great Recession. So the biggest and defining challenge of this time is to do what we did not do after the Great Recession, which is to upskill and reskill the workforce at scale. So to avoid the continued polarization of the labor markets and the very negative consequences that can come from these structural changes, and have a all-court press on reskilling and upskilling so that we can create sustainable and meaningful employment for all of those people that are impacted by these changes that have been going on for some time and are being accelerated after and through this pandemic.
Okay, thank you for that, Jonas. Mellody, I'd like to come to you next. Two things I wanted to ask you about. Can you talk about the gap between Wall Street and Main Street right now? So when we look at this year and we know the S&P 500 has hit record highs, well, at the same time, we've just talked about unemployment levels, which Jonas has touched on, and also at the very low income level, in the US, there's a real risk of a wave of evictions coming for low income renters. So that kind of gap between Wall Street and the average person, How concerned are you about that when we look at the U.S. economic recovery? And also, where are you seeing investment opportunities? I mean, I guess in every difficult climate, there's still opportunities, right? So where are you seeing those?
So first and foremost, I'm always concerned about the well-being of our citizenry. And certainly this has been a really, really challenging time for millions and millions of people in America, but certainly by magnitudes of even bigger numbers, people around the world. So this is not something to be casual about or cavalier. Between food insecurity and housing insecurity, as well as the specific health crisis that has led to a financial crisis, we've had a trifecta of bad. There's no question about that. So why is the stock market reaching new highs? The stock market anticipates the future. That's always what it has done. And so it is anticipating a post-vaccine economy, which will happen. We saw that obviously in terms of the news yesterday from Pfizer, but that has not been in doubt. We've had very clear indications for some time now that the vaccines that were being tested from various potential pharmaceutical companies were promising. And the stock market is saying once the vaccine is out and adopted and taken by lots of people, what does the economy and what does business look like? And from that perspective, the market is perceiving better days ahead. Bill Miller, the very famous investor, has a line that I love so much. And he says, none of us thinks about smallpox when we get on an airplane. This will be a distant memory, no matter how bad it feels right now. Anchoring to this moment will not prove to be what the future looks like. So that's what's been going on with the market, and that's why it's been so strong. Not to mention, we've had 6 stocks, the FANGs plus Microsoft, that have literally been hypercharged by this environment. The fact that we are stuck on our phones and on our computers and desperately needing basic essentials from Amazon has been a boon to those businesses. There's no question. And that's where we've seen them take off in ways that we've never seen stocks grow. And as a result of that, we've had somewhat of a 2-tiered market. I call it the S&P 594, not the S&P 500, because 6 of those stocks account for 70% of the returns over the last 5 years. So those 6 stocks have really pulled ahead and left a lot of companies behind. So getting to your next question, where do we see opportunities? Certainly those companies that have been left behind, certain industries that have been really pummeled during this period, like travel and leisure, which Jonas already mentioned. But also I think we've seen a huge dichotomy that no one is talking about between small and large companies and their performance. The S&P being up for the year and small cap stocks, especially small cap value stocks, being down. Value usually leads coming out of recession. Smaller companies usually lead coming out of recession. All that to us is very, very promising, and therefore that's where we're shopping for years of future returns right now.
Absolutely. And an important point to remember, obviously, about big tech leading those market gains. And you mentioned some good news, which I'm sure we're all aware of, obviously, the progress in the Pfizer vaccine. I want to ask you, Mellody, though, quickly, just another piece of huge news we've had recently, which is the U.S. election outcome. I'm sure we were all following our TVs and Twitter feeds in the last week. We know that Joe Biden is the president-elect. Can I get your reaction to that, and also what a Biden presidency might mean for the investment prospects in the U.S.? I mean, his campaign talked a lot about building back better. Some people are hoping for a green jobs revolution, but we have some hints of what to expect. But what is your view?
So first of all, I want to first say congratulations, obviously, the president-elect, and just note the historic moment here. As a Black woman, it's a moment that gives you goosebumps. That Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president of the United States. It's a stunning outcome, and it's something that gives you hope and faith for humanity, and certainly makes me excited about the prospects for our country and the fact that little girls all over the world can dream bigger dreams because they will see Kamala Harris in a place where we've never seen a woman before in this country. So that is truly thrilling. In terms of the actual outcomes, I think, one, the market liked the outcome. I think the market liked also the split between the Congress, with the Senate maybe staying Republican and the House staying Democratic and the White House being Democratic, I think that there was some sense that that was reassuring to the market, that we wouldn't be seeing a runaway progressive program as a result of that. And so we'll ultimately see how that works out with these two Georgia races. But so far, I think the market has been very, very enthusiastic. And I think part of this is also just a sense of calm, that we've lived in a very turbulent time, not just with COVID, but with our politics have really thrashed us around. And I think people are worn out. So I think despite their beliefs of Republican or Democrat, I'll say right here, I am a Democrat and have been one. But despite that, I think there is a sense that maybe we'll have some smoother seas, and that should be better for American business ultimately, and hopefully better for the world economy.
Absolutely. And we'll come back to, of course, the historic election as well, as you mentioned, Kamala Harris, first female VP. So we'll come back to diversity in a minute. Ian, I want to come to you next. You talked a bit about globalization in your first answer, but can you expand on that? I mean, when we look at this economic crisis and the COVID crisis and just how the kind of supply chain has been challenged, where are you seeing the risks and opportunities coming out of this pandemic?
Yeah, so the first thing is I agree with my colleagues here is that the economy will recover and it will be profound improvement in the economy. We're going through an accelerated business cycle transition where some companies, some sectors will possibly fade away, but other sectors and companies will come to fruition. In terms of supply chain, I really think that there's going to be a focus on resilience as nation states and multinational companies and consumers want to make sure that for the next external shock, that there's a little more predictability about how goods and services for the 21st century will be processed, procured, and distributed around the world. And in many ways, I think Canada's been preparing for this sort of shock for a long, long time. You know, we're a country of 37 million people competing for capital, investment capital, and trade with global giants. And so for many, many decades, we've been building an economy that's literally focused on 21st century solutions. I referenced, clean technology and the importance that that's going to have on every country in the world. Bioproteins, agriculture, and Canada's massive footprint in ag tech and general distribution of proteins. Advanced manufacturing, where Canada and the United States are already enormously integrated in the manufacturing of automobiles, airplanes, electronic vehicle components and whatnot. And so I think that will continue. The other sector, of course, that's been very focused since COVID is life sciences. And we've seen a significant spike in global pharma companies doubling down and significantly expanding their presence in Canada, again, to take advantage of the most highly educated workforce in the world, an enormously diverse workforce where, if you come and operate in Canada, not only can you trade your products to over 51 countries through a free trade footprint that reaches 1.5 billion consumers, but you've got at your fingertips a workforce that literally comes from every corner of the world. And, the Canadian government continues to focus on upping its immigration targets to about 421,000 people a year, which is more than a percentage of our population. And so I think it's all about building a framework, a platform for a resilient economy that can withstand the shock of COVID, the next shock that might be coming, which is not so much a shock, but a realization that ESG is going to be a framework through which global investors, multinationals, sovereign wealth funds will view their investment decisions. And in that context, I mean, if you're building a consumer product, whether it's a smartphone or a car or anything in between, your shareholders, your boards, your consumers are going to want to make sure you're sourcing those materials from sustainable jurisdictions. And again, I think Canada is going to have an advantage in that, from everything from our mining to our resource extraction to our diverse workforce footprint. And so those are all the ingredients that I think are going to enable us to compete and succeed for the next series of challenges that are becoming, amongst which, before I finish, should of course be climate change. The sad reality about climate change in the global supply chain framework is that there are many ports around the world, there are many energy that are being battered by successive hurricanes, typhoons, and weather events that are causing their companies to think about where they can move their supply chain, where they can move their transportation hub. And I think these are all things that are going to be playing themselves out over the years and decades to come.
Thank you for that, Ian. And ESG is actually the focus of our next question. So you pipped me to that, but we can touch a bit more on that in the next question. But thank you for that. Manny, I'm going to come to you next. What advice are you giving your clients who are trying to navigate through this crisis? And I'm thinking in particular of some of the worst hit industries, airlines, retail, hospitality. What advice are you giving them? And also, when we're considering sort of the speed at which companies are having to adapt and change in this COVID environment and in this economic crisis, is there some positive to be found here? I mean, in a way, are some companies, the fact that they're forced to change, is that a good thing for some companies?
Thanks, Vanessa, and I am honored to be on this panel, and I'll try to connect the dots to some of the comments from Jonas and Mellody and Ian, both in ESG and change. So I do start with as you said, all companies are changing at the moment. At the extremes, we have companies where this has been tailwinds, tech, and companies that have been hit. What we're finding, with our clients, because we work on both sides, is that everybody is going through some kind of strategic transformation because of the fact that this world we're in has changed forever. So that's one. That has implications on the labor force, back to your first comment. There are some industries where the demand shift, independent of that, are just going up or down, and so you could have some recovery, even in hard-hit industries like hospitality, as it comes back, and as Mellody says, when we forget that that smallpox was once constrained travel. But both of those have meaningful impacts on labor, because the impact on the jobs are quite varied, not just on type of industry, which is clear, by the demand for the industry, but by the intrinsic nature of the job itself. And what comes with transformation and service automation is that there are a set of jobs that arguably go away forever, and that's been true for many years. And so what's happening is, as all of these companies are wrestling with this at the strategic level, the definition of what is your job, what is the purpose of a company, really has come to the fore for all of our clients and all of our peers. And that's playing out in different ways. Over the last few years, the E part of ESG was increasing in prominence. That will not stop. That will continue. But the jobs, the social dimension has been top of mind for many of our clients. So if you're in one of these industries, in hotels, entertainment, restaurants, travel, even retail, physical retail, under the objective of being more purposeful, caring about your workforce, caring about the communities, I've found that our clients are very thoughtful about what can we do as private companies to limit the impact on job loss, to create a better transition process, recognizing in the long run it's not just the job of the company, it's the job of the overall government and the public-private partnerships to solve that. But the fact that this has elevated to a top a number one issue in boards and CEOs, I think gives me at least hope that we can solve this. And that comes hand in hand with recognizing that your last question, companies have learned to change very fast. We've all learned that we could do stuff in 2020 in weeks or months that might have taken years. Now, depending on what that speed means in terms of the underlying workforce of your company, that in itself creates pressure on job transitions. So how you handle being able to move fast while keeping your commitments to your communities and your workforce. Those are the kinds of trade-offs my peer CEOs are wrestling with at the moment.
Thank you for that, Manny. And Jean-Paul, come to you now. The US, I believe, is your biggest market. Correct me if I'm wrong, but can you talk a bit about then, in the context of the economic recovery, and just how this has affected your sort of strategy there? You've talked, the growth of e-commerce. Is that going to be increasingly important for L'Oréal going forward? Is that something that will be a sort of change that is only accelerated in the future?
Yes, definitely. First, the US is the number one market for L'Oréal. You're right. The market itself, the beauty market in the US, is not bad, by the way. The crisis that we had in front of us was more a supply crisis than a demand crisis, because when stores were closed, of course, consumers couldn't get there and shop. But when we see that when stores reopen, in fact, the consumption is pretty good. But the main transition is what you describe, is the transition to e-commerce. E-commerce is really rising very fast. For us, it's already 25% of our business. It was almost zero 5 years ago. In some other countries, it's even more. It's 50% in China, for example, but it's rising everywhere. And of course, the transition of consumers from brick and mortar to e-commerce is creating some disruption, disrupting retail. And that's why also we have to adapt to this evolution and follow our consumers where they're going. So I think that one of the effects of this COVID-19 crisis will be the huge acceleration of e-commerce. In a few weeks or a few months, e-commerce has gained what was forecast to be gained in several years. So there has been a huge acceleration, which is the evolution. It was something that we anticipated. That's why we started before other companies, and it's clear that it's the new model for the future.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Paul. I want to move on now to talking about diversity and inequality. The Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously in the US and spread globally, this has been a huge issue this year. It played a role in the election outcome, of course, but also it's a conversation now that people are having at every level of society, in boardrooms around the world. This is something that, everyone is talking about this. And Mellody, I want to come to you first. You've done so much work in the diversity space, and also you're co-CEO, obviously, of the largest minority-owned investment firm. Is this time different? Do you think, can you give a sense of just how companies, how the private sector is sort of engaging with this issue now, and how that's changed in recent years in terms of prioritizing diversity? Is this time different, do you think?
I think in so many ways it's not different, and in so many ways it's very different. So it's not different in that we've seen this movie before. We've had iterations of civil rights and a real outcry in our country for fairness and equality. We've seen this. Obviously, Emancipation Proclamation, the Voting Rights Act, now this period. We also know that any person who walks around in my packaging knows that on any given day in this country, very, very bad things happen to people of color. And so it's well telegraphed and well known. We just had a situation over the summer where the inequality was captured on camera in terms of specifically a horrific murder. And that was just one of many things that happened that were captured on camera, not captured on camera, but really did show what is the pains and anguish and the sins of our society. So that's the one piece. What's different? This is now landed at the feet of corporate America. These societal ills, these societal issues are now corporate America's problem in a very different way. If you look back at the 1960s, one would say that government had to deal with this. And it was around changing laws. And that's where you saw the biggest breakthroughs in diversity. It was actually in public offices. That's why when you look at television in America these days, you see black and brown mayors, but you don't see black and brown CEOs. So government has already dealt with this. Corporate has it at their feet, and they have it at their feet, not just this, but many other issues in ways that have never happened before because of the viral nature of our society. Employees, vendors, other stakeholders have an opinion, and they're holding corporate America accountable for not only what they say and do, but what they don't say and don't do. And I think because of that, this issue has taken on a new sense of urgency and a new sense of importance that I'm hoping ultimately will lead to real and meaningful change in terms of diverse representation inside of companies, diverse use of vendors in terms of business diversity, and diverse use of philanthropy when you think about the charities and the various organizations that corporations support.
I mean, you said you're hopeful of change. Are you optimistic then? Are you confident that this time there will be change initiated by corporate America? Is that something that you have a lot of faith in?
It's a wait and see approach for me. I think there's a lot of talk, and I said we need more action. We need more elbow grease around this issue. So the things that I want to see measurements. If it matters, it counts. And I say, corporate America, start counting. One of my favorite lines is math has no opinion. Let's just do the math. Look at the math. Look at your organization by ethnicity. No rolling everyone together in one multicultural umbrella of race and gender. Because looking by ethnicity shows you underrepresentation from the board of the organization all the way down to the bowels of the organization. And no taking credit if 90% of your Black employees are assistants. So really understanding that piece. I believe you get what you incent. And in corporate America, we understand incentives. We have incentives based upon outcomes, earnings, profits, hitting project launch dates, sales, you name it. But we haven't put incentives around hitting diversity targets. And that is something that I think is one of the reasons why we haven't seen true outcomes. Not to mention, we haven't been willing to set targets. And what goal can you hit if you don't set a target? Now, some people say to me, well, that's a quota. There is a meaningful difference between a quota, a number that you have to make, and a target, which is a goal. And again, think of earnings targets. We have ranges of what earnings we think we're going to hit. So this is language that we're used to. This is behavior that we're used to. Now can we overlay it into an area that in corporate America we say is mission critical? And I actually believe that is true. I believe that if you are a not diverse company in this country, if you lack diversity, you are committing corporate suicide. And I use that term very, very specifically and intentionally. It's not a question of if you will die, it's when. Now, it could take a very long time, but I don't see a positive outlook for a company that believes it's trying to be forward-thinking and 21st century that lacks a diverse business environment.
Thank you, Mellody. And that's a really important point too about targets. Thanks for your answer on that. Manny, I'm going to come to you next. Can you just talk briefly about how Bain is approaching diversity, but also I'm interested in your views on diversity in the context of leadership and the new normal. So do you think that coming out of this crisis or in this crisis now, are there higher expectations on senior managers now to be better communicators, to empathize with staff, to be engaged with issues that they care about, like diversity? We'll come to sustainability in a minute, but can you just also put diversity in the context of leadership, I guess, and expectations now on senior management?
Yes, thanks, Vanessa. And I'll build on some of Mellody's points on both those topics. You have to fully embrace diversity as an enabler of great outcomes. It's for business, it's for people. And so under the broader rubric of the switch to ESG is real, this has been one big part of it. And you can build on it, for a global firm like us. And he's speaking as a Brown CEO, building on all the successes and failures or lack of success over many years around getting more diverse globally. We're American versus mix of nationalities, obviously women, gender, the issues within the American context, and this will vary country to country. That being more diverse on Latinx and Black and Native American and Asian American, you have to have progress and embrace it. inside the company. I think that's something we've been trying to do and then continuing to do. You also have to go outside the bounds of your company in your core products and services. So one signal for me of how real this is that as we made a commitment to actually build a capability for a client base to help them improve their diversity, the take-up of that has been rapid, and it's usually a good test for corporate strategy projects by CEOs. If ESG is now on the agenda that you would engage at organizations like us, that's usually a sign it's now one of the top priority topics, and that's absolutely happening. And so it has to, and we have to role model what we do outside the company with our customers, with our suppliers, and what we're doing inside, and continue to make this. And I will call out that the issue of Black diversity in corporate America is one of the places where there's been much less progress than all the other flavors of diversity we've all been working on for many years. And so connect to your last topic, what that means for leadership. And it's a little bit why I said at the beginning of this panel, what changed the most this year is that leaders have embraced this. Often diversity and environment and ESG issues would come sometimes from the front line because of how the talent entering the workforce really care so much. But for an organization to change up and down, if you have the top and the bottom and the middle all pulling together and caring about that topic, then you can actually drive change inside and outside the company. And so to have leaders who actually embrace diversity at the concept that it's important, and then understand what that means in how you behave, how you promote, how you care, how you fix all of your issues unbiased, conscious or unconscious, and role model that in everything we say and do. That's what allows organizations to actually change, and it's clear that this is a priority. And so, we've made that, and I'm thrilled to see that up and down this year and beyond. And I'm seeing it with our clients. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic about this, that this will actually continue to make all of our organizations and ultimately our world better. But it's a lot to do, and we'll need to stick at it in the years to come.
Thank you, Manny. Ian, I was going to come to you next. Do you think, is this something, do you want to comment on maybe how diversity is being approached in the Canadian business landscape, or is there a different angle you might want to touch on here?
For sure. Diversity in Canada I think it's part of our DNA, and it's part of us being a trading nation that has relied on immigration to build our population. As I mentioned, 37 million people. We're competing against giants. So you'll hear it from our Prime Minister, you'll hear it from businesses across the country, the notion that diversity for us is a strength. It's not framed as a sort of a compliance mechanism or a box to tick. It's something that we inherently understand and that we know we need to succeed at, promote, and celebrate. Now, I'm not saying that we're immune to racial tensions in Canada, or that our corporations are leading the tables in terms of diversification on the boards yet. But certainly from the political leadership, it's really being understood across Canada that diversity makes us a better country. It makes our startup companies better. It makes our big corporations more in tune with their markets around the world. It makes our schoolyards a better place to cultivate really global citizens as children grow up. One of the frameworks, the public policy frameworks that the successive governments in Canada have pursued is very aggressive immigration targets. But specifically in recent years, there's an immigration policy called the Global Skills Strategy. And in a growing economy, again, a small country like Canada realizes we need immigrants to help us. Well, nowadays, if you're operating a business in Canada and you need to recruit a leader in a certain sector with a certain skill set from anywhere in the world, you can now land those people in Canada with their visa within about 2 weeks. And that's really been a game changer for the expansion of companies, for the growth of companies. But it's also accelerating the notion that diversity makes the economy better and makes our communities better. And hopefully it makes our politics more inclusive and richer in the long term.
Thanks for that, Ian. Jonas, I want to come to you just briefly. Are you seeing clients prioritize diversity in recruitment now in a way that you haven't done before? It kind of comes back to my point I asked Mellody, is this time different? Are companies giving this more than face time? Are they sort of putting their money where their mouth is and really prioritizing this in hiring?
I think there's a much greater awareness that this is a business necessity. This, of course, is the right thing to do. But more and more corporations are realizing that this is really what they need to do to be successful in the long term, just as Mellody pointed out. But I can talk a bit about, our own journey and my own journey around the issue of the diversity and inclusion, because I think, we understand it's the right thing to do, and we've always done that. We've had programs in place to make the change, yet change never happened at the pace that we were expecting or that we were hoping. It was one of many initiatives. So what we've identified within our own organization is that this requires a cultural change. We have to create a culture of conscious inclusion. The only person who can drive that change is the leader, who has to hold himself or herself accountable to making this change come true in the organizations that they lead. So leadership, just as Manny talked about, is immensely important. And it's all about the level of priority leaders put this on. If it is an initiative that is amongst many other initiatives, some make progress, others don't. But what we have found, at least, is that we've changed our approach around gender diversity as a first step. We've seen tremendous progress in a very short period of time because we elevated the importance. To Mellody's point, we had clear targets, and our board holds us and me accountable to meeting those targets. But frankly, I thought we were doing quite well in terms of including our Black and Brown colleagues in the organization. But the events of the summer here in the US really drove home the point to me personally, speaking to our employees, but also speaking to Black and Brown friends, that we were quite significantly off the mark in terms of the level of resources and focus and deliberate initiatives we have in place to be able to shift the needle at an acceptable rate of improvement. And so that's really my learning and our learning coming out of this social crisis that we're faced with in the US as it relates to race, but that we're also seeing emerge in a number of other places. Youth unemployment in Southern Europe, we think, is going to be a major issue post-pandemic, that we take deliberate and purposeful actions to change this. So I am, as much as Mellody described it, both optimistic in terms of the intent, greater intent, but in the end, it's all about the results. And unless corporations make successive and substantial improvement, we are not going to be able to come out of this situation, which causes a very polarized society with unpredictable outcomes, which is not a good environment for corporations to be successful in, nor for their contributions to a broader stakeholder agenda. So I think this is a hugely important topic, and we are seeing many corporations paying a lot more attention to this. But in the end, it's going to be down to the leadership taking the actions that's required to really make a substantial change, because we have been talking about this for a very long time and frankly made very, very limited progress for all the good rhetoric we have passed on this topic for many years.
Thank you, Jonas. Jean-Paul, I'm going to come to you now, though I'd like to turn to ESG and sustainability. If you do want to say something quickly about diversity, please feel free to. But I wanted to ask you about sustainability, because when we look at the new normal and stakeholder pressure and just the priorities on sustainability, the pressure from consumers, can you talk a bit about how L'Oreal is approaching that sustainability challenge and what you're changing sort of long term to meet the sustainability challenge?
Yes, maybe 2 words on diversity. You know, diversity has always been super important at L'Oréal. I think we were one of the first companies in 2000 to create a function, a job of Chief Diversity Officer, and since then we have done our best efforts. I agree that you have always to push hard in the direction because it never goes as fast as you want. So for example, we made a lot of progress on gender diversity. We are recognized today as probably one of the best companies in the world for gender diversity, but we still have many efforts and progress to make on other diversity directions, and we are doing that. So on ESG is super important also. You know, when you are the number one company in the beauty world, when you're the champion of beauty, you have to make sure that you do your best also to make the planet a beautiful place. And so we started a program in 2013 called Sharing Beauty with All, with very ambitious commitments, reducing by 60% carbon emission, consumption of water, etc. In fact, 7 years later, we are ahead of our commitments. And so now we have set some new, very ambitious commitments for 2030. And then, for example, we committed that by 2030, all our sites would be carbon neutral, that all the plastic that we use will be coming from recycled plastic, and that all our packaging would be also recyclable. So for us, ESG in terms of environment, in terms of responsibility, and all direction is absolutely super important for us, for our consumers, for the stakeholders, for the whole community.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your thoughts both on diversity and ESG. Manny, I want to ask you briefly, because we're running out of time, and I want to get to the last question, which I'm going to put to everyone. But before we do that, can you give me a sense of whether you think companies will emerge from this crisis and from this time that we're in, having to deliver responsible capitalism because there's a new pressure, because there's more pressure than ever before? And it kind of comes back to a point Mellody made, which is, you know, you made that point, Mellody, in the context of diversity, as in you're going to die, you're going to be left behind if you don't address this. And I would argue the same is true for sustainability. So, Manny, what are your thoughts on that in terms of companies having to deliver more responsible capitalism and sustainability?
I actually connect them all, Vanessa. You know, ESG has sustainability and diversity and being good corporate citizens all linked together. And the reason is that for any company to succeed, you have to have great value proposition for your customers, for your clients, and they care about this. And you have to have a great value proposition for your team, for your employees, for your talent, and they care about this too. So for any company coming out of this crisis in the years to come to be able to attract great people and meet the needs of your customers, you have to embrace this. And I think the challenge everyone's facing around all of this, if you look at this, we'll have to survive COVID. It's clearly going to be different impacts for different kinds of jobs. You know, e-commerce was mentioned. Well, most work will have some flavor of omni-channel working, where we will just change the underlying nature of work. And we have to be more sustainable, and we have to be more diverse, and we have to help deal with, you know, labor pool shifts and changes and job reductions. That's the integrated challenge of the next few years. But I don't think this will be a choice.
I think we may, is Manny still? I think we may have lost his audio for a second.
I'm not sure where I lost you, but I think my point at the end was that this is not optional. That because clients and talent demand it, we're all going to need to do this.
Okay, very important point. Thank you, Manny. My last question, I think we have just over 5 minutes left, and I'm hoping to get an answer from everyone on this one. Again, going back to our theme where we started, the new normal and adapting to change. I'm interested to know for each of you what the pandemic, what this crisis has permanently changed, either in terms of, you know, lessons learned that you'll take forward, an aspect of your business strategy that you've changed, which you'll never change back to how it was, or it could be also from a, personal management perspective. We talked a bit about leadership in this discussion, and that sort of the expectations on leadership now to be empathetic, to address sustainability, to address diversity. So however you want to answer this, but I'm looking for a sort of permanent change or lesson you'll bring forward. Mellody, I'll come to you first for this one.
All right, I think of a couple of things. So first, I love this line. Jamie Dimon said, "We took the business continuity test and passed." So first and foremost, just this idea of business continuity. I think what changed forever is this foundation of continuity that none of us really knew if it was going to work, and has exceeded probably most people's expectations. So that's first and foremost. I think also what has changed forever is probably some form. Now, I don't think we'll over-rotate to people not going into an office, but some form of increased workplace flexibility and people not necessarily being in an office 5 days a week or more than that. We might see more flexibility in that regard than what we've seen in times past. And lastly, I do not believe we're going to get on airplanes and fly around the world for one meeting anymore. I just don't think that is going to happen in the same way that it has happened in times past.
Thank you, Mellody. Jonas, I'm going to come to you next because Mellody actually reminded me of how I wanted to phrase this question to you, which is the context of office life and the new normal, which is us looking at our screens. Will we return to office life like it was in a pre-COVID world? And indeed hiring. I mean, when you look at the challenges of integrating new staff, when for most people, they can't even meet their new colleagues in person and get a sense of that sort of corporate culture. So what is your view on that? And if you want to add a different lesson, feel free to, but I'd like your view on that as well, please.
Yeah, so if I start with my lesson, I think it really comes from this very quick shift on the health and safety being the number one priority for our employees and our clients and all of our associates. And that really, from a leadership perspective, brings this notion of thinking about our people and them bringing their whole self to work, and that we have many other dimensions that we need to think about as leaders when we think about our people than maybe we were aware of before. As to your question around the future of work and how this is all going to shape up, I think it's going to be going back to the office for sure, but how we engage with work is going to change permanently. And the way it's changing is very much in line with what Mellody was talking about. Employees for the longest time have been asking for more flexibility to combine their work life and their personal lives. Companies, although technology was available pre-pandemic, by and large only let a small part of their population work remotely and find that flexibility. So we think that the lasting legacy of the pandemic as it relates to how workers engage with organizations is that they will have much more flexibility in structuring work and their personal lives in a way that works for them. And employers have experienced that despite whatever misgivings they may have had or lack of belief in this way of working, after the pandemic, they're saying, well, this clearly was a great example of a very quick shift into something that I'm very comfortable with supporting. So employees and people working in different ways within organizations will have that as a lasting legacy of the pandemic. People want to come to the office. They want to be engaged with other people. They want to experience human interaction. People join in organization, need to be brought on board and have an opportunity to meet their colleagues in person. There's no doubt about that. But the flexibility aspect is really what's going to be the lasting legacy here. And that's all based on the experience that we have from the pandemic and that many organizations will be very comfortable with offering to their employees, we believe.
Thank you, Jonas. Okay, we've just got 2 minutes left, so we'll try if you guys can be really quick on your last answers. Ian, I'll come to you first, and then we'll go Jean-Paul and then Manny to finish.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think in one word, resilience. And I think we've really learned to understand the importance of building resilient economies, building resilient companies, building resilient political institutions. And, COVID is not the first and it won't be the last massive shock to the global economy, but we're living in the midst of two other externalities, if you will, that will require resilient economies, companies, and political institutions. ESG and the whole framework that global investors are viewing their targets through, and climate change, which is undeniable and will require companies, economies, and political institutions to be resilient and steadfast in their pursuit of resilient economies.
Thank you, Ian. Jean-Paul, I'll come to you next.
This crisis has shown that anything can happen anytime, and that, as it was said, it's super important for a company, small or big, to be very agile and flexible. And what was described in terms of flexibility for employees is true also for consumers. Consumers want also to have flexibility; they want to have choice, and so companies have learned that they have to offer really different options in order to be flexible and agile everywhere.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And finally, Manny.
I agree. Jean-Paul's comment earlier, retail's gone e-commerce fast. I think of work as the equivalent of going to omni-channel working, that it's not going to be 100% remote, but it's always going to be some combination of in-person or virtual or at third-party customer sites. And that'll vary not just by job, but often by individual preference. And we're all going to have to figure that out. And yet all of that happening while organizations are just more purposeful in this world to come. And I think that's a good thing.
Thank you, Manny. And thank you so much to all of you. So many important points there about leadership, about corporate America's responsibility to help fight racial injustice, about office life, what is the new normal, the jobs recovery. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you to those of you who tuned in as well.